We've had very slow growth in the UK for some years now. Keir Starmer recognises that this is a problem. It's going to be very difficult to improve public services without very large increases in spending. It's ultimately about investment. The UK for too long has been living off its past, if you like, and we need to start to build for the future.
The United Kingdom has a new Prime Minister and he's promised to restore economic stability. On Keir Starmer's list of things to fix ailing public services, low productivity and lacklustre investment. To talk about this, I'm joined now by Greg Thwaites, Research Director at the Resolution Foundation. That's an independent think tank focused on improving living standards in the UK. Greg, thanks so much for joining us. Now, for people who don't know much about Keir Starmer yet, how would you describe his approach to the economy?
Well, Keir Starmer has prioritised the economy. It's something that's been a problem in the UK for many years now. We've had slow growth for 15 years. GDP per capita grew about 4 or 5% over the past 15 years, compared to like 40% in the period before that. That's the national income per person. So we've had very slow growth in the UK for some years now. Keir Starmer recognises, he's not the only politician that recognises this, that this is a problem. And his response has been to prioritise this issue. In terms of policy specifics, I think it's much less clear at this early stage what they're going to do, but they've emphasised stability, so no surprises. They have emphasised not putting up the main rates of taxation in the UK. And they've talked a lot about maybe relaxing some of the constraints in trade with Europe a tiny bit. But generally speaking, there's not a huge amount of detail in exactly what they're going to do with the economy, just that they make it a priority.
I want to dig into a couple of those topics that you mentioned. But first, let's look at one of the most pressing issues for most people, and that is the cost of living, and particularly the cost of housing. In the past decade or so, the cost of buying a home in the UK has risen far faster than wages have. The average house now costs 8 times the average salary, and in places like London, it's many times more than that. How do you think Keir Starmer is planning to address that challenge?
So I think there's going to be two ways of doing that. The first one is to build more houses. So the UK has record high levels of immigration, and the population's growing quite quickly as a result. People want more space, and we haven't been doing a very good job of having housing supply keep up with housing demand. So the most important thing is to build more houses, and I think they recognise that. It might be slightly easier for them than it was for the Conservative government, because of who their constituency is. It's younger voters and where the constituency is. So more in the cities than on the outskirts of cities or in the countryside where people are more hostile to construction. So the first thing to do is to build more houses, because that won't just bring down house prices, which have lots of other factors determining them, but also bring down rents as well. And lots of people are renting and they're going to continue renting. That's not going to be easy, but I think that's the first thing they're going to try and do. The second thing they might try and do is make it easier for people to get mortgages. So there have been schemes to help people buy houses in the UK, some of the deposit being financed with a loan by the government. And we'll see whether they try and do something along those lines as well, as in many other countries where the government intervenes in the mortgage market.
So all of this, of course, costs money. And that brings us to the next issue, which is taxation, a huge issue during this campaign. If we look at this chart, we can see that taxes have been going up for decades under both the Labour Party and the Conservatives. But there's been an especially steep increase in the past few years. And yet, as we keep hearing, people are not feeling the benefit. Hospital waiting lists are getting longer, libraries are closing, more people are using food banks than ever before. What is this new government planning to do to make sure that people actually feel the benefit of paying their taxes?
The main reason that taxes have had to go up recently in the United Kingdom is that interest rates have increased, and the government borrows money just like people borrow money. And the interest bill that it has to pay on that debt has gone up, and it's gone up more and faster in the UK than in many other countries. So that's the first reason why you're getting higher taxes, but people aren't feeling the benefit in terms of public services. The second reason is that the country, in line with most high income countries, is aging, and older people, they retire, they claim state pensions, they use the health service more. And so there's this demographic issue that's pushing up on the money that the government needs to spend. then another issue is there has been for several decades a peace dividend, whereby we've been able to cut defense spending from about 9% of GDP to where it is now, which is slightly more than 2%. And that peace dividend is basically going to stop paying, because we're not going to be able to cut defense spending any more than that. And we may, in fact, have to increase it because of the international environment. So you put all those factors together, and what you're getting is higher taxes, but no more money for public services, really, because of all of these extra demands on the public purse. So what the government's going to have to do is it's going to have to make sure that public services are using that money as efficiently as possible. And there are plenty of things you can do in the UK to do that. So, for example, joining up social care, older people or vulnerable people, too many of them are in hospital when they should be in social care instead, and that's making the hospital system function less well. But it's going to be very difficult for them to improve public services without raising taxes, even if they do find those efficiencies, because of all of these driving forces that I've mentioned. And of course, slow growth is an additional one, because if the economy is not growing, then it's not generating tax revenues. And if there's no tax revenues, then you haven't got the money to spend on public services.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about the sluggish growth that you've mentioned, because since the pandemic, the UK has recovered far more slowly than other major economies like the US. So we should say it is still outperforming Germany, for example. Keir Starmer describes his economic policy as both pro-business and pro-worker. What does that mean in practice?
Well, I think the most important thing they could do in terms of pro-business would be to lower costs of trade with our biggest trading partner, which is the European Union. Since the UK left the European Union a few years ago, it's become much more expensive and complicated to trade with the EU because of the nature of the deal that we struck. And it hasn't really got much easier to trade with any other country. That's one of the reasons, that's placing extra costs on business. And so I think the best thing they could do for business is to lower some of those costs by, when the trading cooperation agreement, which is the agreement between the UK and the EU, gets reviewed or renegotiated, it's done in such a way as to make it easier for people to trade across the channel, like it used to be. Perhaps not as easy as it used to be, but a bit more. Then when it comes to stability would also be good for business. So there's one thing about what the rules are, but then there's another thing about the rules repeatedly changing. And Keir Starmer's emphasised that he wants stability, and we'll see if he gets that. In terms of being pro-worker, the Labour Party has proposed to improve workers' rights, and we'll see exactly what they do there. So the Conservative government did a great job of raising the minimum wage. We have one of the highest minimum wages in the world now, and we've made huge strides in reducing the incidence of low hourly pay. But other rights, so for example, rights to sick pay or rights to knowing what your hours are, haven't kept pace with that. And one of the things that the government's talked about is closing that gap.
These Brexit negotiations with the EU were so drawn out. They took so many years. I am wondering what you think Keir Starmer can really do. What kind of an improved deal can he achieve, do you think?
Well, I don't think there's any immediate prospects of the UK rejoining the European Union. I don't think the politicians are up for that. I don't think the EU 27 are probably up for that, because it would be quite problematic. But I think there are many things that we can do short of that. So, for example, Theresa May negotiated a deal which kept the whole of the United Kingdom, roughly speaking, in the customs union and in the single market for goods. So it's possible to trade across borders without any frictions or any paperwork. And that's a deal that isn't the deal that Boris Johnson signed, but it is essentially what Northern Ireland has. So Northern Ireland has this strange position where it's kind of half in the UK single market and half in the EU single market. And given that we've negotiated that deal once before, it's conceivable that we could negotiate that again if our partners in the EU 27 would like it. I think I can see advantages on both sides of that, but it's certainly not a given. And it would require the UK to align to European rules that it has no control over. But of course, when you look at a country like Canada, very close to the US, or New Zealand, very close to Australia, it's normal, in fact, for the smaller partner, which the UK is now, to align with the rules of the bigger partner. And I expect us to do the same thing, whether or not we're in the single market and the customs union.
You mentioned the issue of migration. That was, of course, a huge deal around the Brexit time, but we have seen a big increase in immigration from outside the EU, largely due to the fact that the UK has a shortage of workers. What is Keir Starmer's approach to immigration in the context of the UK's labour market?
So I think that they will not try and make as big an issue out of it as the Conservatives did. I think it's an issue that the Conservatives thought that they were ahead on, maybe, and wanted to make more salient. I think that it's going to be very difficult to improve public services without either very large increases in spending so that you can increase wages and get residents working for the public services, or you either do that or you have migration and lots of doctors and nurses and people working in the care industry. And then the same goes for universities as well. So British universities are pretty good, and they're not making money out of the UK undergraduates. They're making money out of foreign students, and a lot of the immigration we get is related to foreign students. So I expect that immigration is going to remain high in the UK. Many of the fundamentals that drive it to do with both push and pull factors, so things going on in the UK and also things going on in the rest of the world. The UK, notwithstanding its recent difficulties, is still a moderately prosperous country, about as prosperous as Canada or France. We speak the world's language, and we're about 1% of the world's population, and we have lots of kind of post-colonial links with countries and large diasporas in the UK from many countries, very populous countries like South Asian countries, Nigeria now as well. So I would expect migration, the fundamentals of migration, to stay high.
I want to touch upon one of the reasons that the UK has a shortage of workers, and that's because a lot of people are on long-term sick leave at the moment. How significant is that when it comes to labour shortages?
It's very significant for tax revenues and for growth. And that's what we've seen in the UK. Is in the 2010s, we saw the employment rate boom and sickness fall for most of that decade. And that was a huge success story. And we had very weak productivity. So the amount that each worker was making wasn't great, but we had lots of workers because we had lots of people in work. And that was kind of masking our weak productivity and helping the economy to grow. Unfortunately, this decade, that's gone into reverse. And we've seen the health of the UK population deteriorate. And unlike most other high-income countries, with the exception of the US, we've actually seen the amount of people in work fall rather than increase. So you look at Italy, France, they're getting lots more people into the labour force, something that we did very well last decade, but has gone into reverse this decade. And part of the reason for this is population health, and it's a particularly strange and difficult issue when we look at population health amongst younger workers. So until recently, it was the case that the older you were, the sicker you were, and the more likely you were to be out of work with sickness. That's no longer true in the UK, and it's actually the case, believe it or not, that you're more likely to be out of work because of ill health in your early 20s than you are in your early 40s. That's never been the case before. That's largely accounted for by poor mental health amongst younger people. And so this is a really big and important issue that's going to cause us problems and going to require focus for years or decades in the UK. It's not as, I mean, it's possible. We've seen some of these trends in other countries as well. So I don't think the UK is alone, but it's something that we all have to deal with. And it's hit us particularly hard in the UK, I think.
If this is a trend that we've seen in the last 10 years, would you say this coincides quite neatly with a lack of investment in healthcare?
So it's possible that some of the deteriorating population health and the deteriorating labour supplies of people in work is because of very long waiting lists for health treatment. But I don't think that's the main driver, to be honest. I think when we look at deteriorating population health, it's to do with obesity, and it's to do with poor mental health. And there is some evidence that people are finding it harder to access services for those things. But a lot of the people on waiting lists, which are far too long in the UK, are retired older people. So I think there's probably something going on, but I think there are other reasons driving especially higher reported rates of poor mental health in the UK.
That's really interesting. I have a final question for you. Your work focuses on how to improve living standards for people in the UK. So if you could give Keir Starmer one piece of advice when it comes to developing policy in this area, what would it be?
That's a really good question. Sometimes I wish I was Chancellor, but now you've actually put me on the spot, and I get to be Chancellor for a few minutes. So I think the main thing to do is to raise investment in the UK. That's investment from the government and investment from, especially from the private sector, which is extremely low. So you need to think about relaxing planning rules to make it easier to build. You need to think about that, reforming the pension system so that there's more investment in UK firms. It's ultimately about investment. The UK for too long has been living off its past, if you like, and we need to start to build for the future.
Okay, so we hope that Keir Starmer has been watching this, listening carefully to your advice. Greg Thwaites, Research Director at the Resolution Foundation, thank you so much.